think Scott Morrison deserves a good deal of the credit for driving this, and of course also taking the decision to alienate the French president, Emmanuel Macron, which has been the cost of this decision. Boris Johnson also played a part. He's not famous for his strategic vision and long-term planning, but between them, I think they did a lot of the lifting. But as I said, the US National Security Council has been moving in this direction for some time. And so they were pushing on an open door. It's a pity Joe Biden couldn't remember Scott Morrison's name when he was announcing AUKUS, but that illustrates the point I made earlier about the president's waning powers. But you're right, I think, to give Scott Morrison credit for this. And I think it's important to recognize that since you and I last met in Sydney, there has been a significant shift. Back then, I think it was becoming apparent to more and more Australians that Cold War II was underway, and any notion of a harmonious relationship with China was fading. Since then, it's only got worse. Not only has China lent extremely hard on Australia economically, but Australia, as much as any other country, has been impacted by a pandemic that had its origin in China and occurred because, without a doubt, negligence happened not only in Wuhan, not only at the provincial level, but also at the national level. This was an avoidable pandemic. Had the Chinese authorities been honest in December of 2019 about what was happening and not attempted to deny that they had a new pathogen with human-to-human transmission, we might not be still grappling, as you are in Australia, with lockdowns and all the other disruption that the pandemic's brought about. So things have moved a long way since you and I last spoke, and the rest of the world now sees what was becoming obvious to Australians 2 or more years ago, that we are in something like a Cold War. And it's good to know that the administration in Washington gets that too, even if they don't like calling it a Cold War. You'll perhaps have noticed that Joe Biden last week in New York explicitly disavowed the notion that we're in a new Cold War. But that just means we are in one, but we don't want to call it by that name for fear of inflaming the relations with China anymore. But we're clearly in a new strategic landscape. And it's good that we're taking concrete steps, both diplomatic and military steps, to try to have a solution to the problem posed by Xi Jinping and the Chinese Communist Party. And that problem is that they appear to be on some kind of warpath with increasingly aggressive tactics, not just in constructing military and naval bases in the South China Sea, but in threatening Taiwan. And saying again and again that the ultimate objective of Xi Jinping is to bring Taiwan under the control of Beijing, of the Chinese Communist Party. This is a dangerous road that China's going down. And the best way to prevent this leading to conflict is to create some kind of deterrence. Deterrence needs to have a diplomatic and a military dimension to it. And showing China that it is increasingly isolated, that in the region and globally, the United States has allies and has a strategy is extremely important. It's a way, I think, of discouraging Xi Jinping from doing something which would be enormously risky and destabilizing, namely trying to change the status quo by taking control of Taiwan. That has the potential to create an enormous geopolitical crisis. And I think the real significance of AUKUS, along with the Quad, is that they are steps to deter China from taking that reckless step.
Yeah, the amazingly prescient Lee Kuan Yew from Singapore, one of the cleverest statesmen, I suspect, of the last century, warned some 20 years ago that this sort of approach would become necessary. It was extraordinary how far he could see into the future and how well he understood it. And I must say, it seems to me that sort of group or allying together of people who have everything to lose, even if they're not so much in sync with one another's thinking, but everything to lose by China becoming dominant in the region and ultimately globally, is a big part of the answer. Before we come back to China, because I'd really like to explore this, I know how well you understand that country. A couple of other things. One point on the way through, it's easy to despair of leadership in the West today, and the sort of impact of fragmentation, polarisation, what have you. There's a really interesting set of numbers, though, around Australian attitudes towards nuclear submarines in the heart of this. 6 months ago in March, a reputable poll found that something like 35 to 38% of Australians favoured switching submarines and finding nuclear powered. Remember, Australia's the only country in the world that has an actual prohibition on nuclear energy. And the Prime Minister has been saying that doesn't mean we'll have a nuclear energy industry in Australia, and we won't have nuclear weapons either. Just the submarines are now sealed for life, all the rest of it. But the point I wanted to make is a really interesting one. There's been a doubling of support for the ideas of obtaining these things. And even the Green voters in this country are surprisingly supportive. I wouldn't say there's a majority, but there's close to it. In rural Australia, it's up in the 90s. The point, Neil, is an interesting one. It's not just that the perception of China as a dangerous place has suddenly exploded in the last 6 months. It was already very high. It's clear cut-through leadership that says we have a problem, we're going to deal with it, does still move the electorate. And so many politicians seem to have forgotten that in the West. Leadership matters.
That's right, John. Of course, one mustn't over-egg the pudding. It's going to take quite a while for this new submarine capability to be ready. And that's why other aspects of the deal are in many ways more important in the short run. And I think we're also seeing here a growth from intelligence cooperation into something much more military and naval in its character. We're moving from Five Eyes to something new. It seems unclear if New Zealand is going to be part of that. Probably not. But I think it's an interesting illustration that there is something to Britain's post-Brexit vision. The phrase global Britain was used a lot by the proponents of Brexit. Didn't really mean terribly much until now. And now it becomes clear that there is some substance to that. And it wasn't just a publicity stunt to send a British aircraft carrier all the way to the Indo-Pacific region. So I think this is important, not just for Australia. I think it's important for Britain too. And as I said, I think it's an important way in which the Biden administration is going beyond what Trump had done. Trump had, to give him his due, focused American minds on the Chinese threat and had created a complete shift in attitudes, not only amongst voters, but I think at the level of the policy elites. And as a result, the US moved steadily under Trump's leadership from tariffs to something much more like a policy of containment. But Trump was never terribly good with allies. It was something that his America First strategy didn't really include, and he had to be frequently topped off the ledge when he began threatening allies with tariffs, not to mention asking people like the South Koreans to pay for the privilege of having US troops. So I think in an important way, the Biden administration recognizes that you can't have a successful Cold War strategy without allies. And although I think the fall of Kabul did immense damage to American relations with its allies, AUKUS at least has done something to steady the ship and show that there is some substance to the talk of a more diplomatically adroit American strategy.
I want to go straight to that point because the flip side of the leadership that I think the Prime Minister in Australia has shown on this new alliance is the one that you just alluded to. Given that there's been an enormous focus on its central part, and indeed the thing that drove it in the first place, submarines, we're now faced with the reality that it's dawning on us that it'll be even longer on current timelines before we obtain the first one than it would have been with the French ones. It may be 2040. Goodness only knows what might have happened by then. And so you've had all sorts of activity in the public debate about, well, should we try and lease some? Should we try and do this or do that, embed Australian crews on American boats, whatever it happens to be? This is going to be the big test. Will the thing in this country in particular succeed? Will it deliver? Will it be durable? One of the questions that arises out of that is that my understanding is that despite declining defence spending, particularly as a proportion of GDP in America, your boatyards, or not your, but the American boatyards are chock-a-block. They're building Virginia classes as quickly as they can. I don't know how the Brits are going with Astutes. There's no place for us in the production line. And people are pointing out, well, there's not much point in Australia having some nuclear submarines if it just means the Americans and the Brits have got less. You need to expand what the alliance has available to it. And one of the issues then becomes, I suppose, an engineering, technical, logistical one. But is it going to be possible for somebody to actually crank up production? And then domestically for us, will we accept that you shouldn't confuse industry and defence policy? It may be not realistic to try and build at least the first handful of them here at all. And so there's a lot of issues there that go to the durability, the credibility, the way in which this deal will be seen by friends and foes alike. So that leadership I talked about will need a lot of follow through, and it's going to require a lot of goodwill, frankly, amongst all partners. I hope that there is a lot of goodwill in Britain towards Australia. I think there is in America. Your friend and colleague at Harvard, Victor Davis Hanson, tells me that research consistently shows a great fondness on the part of the Americans for Australians in an environment when Americans are reluctant, I understand this too, to get involved in troubles abroad. That friendship bond seems to me to be very important.
Well, I think it's important not to fixate on the submarines, partly because of the long timeline, but also because the nature of war is changing. Any conflict between the United States and China, say over Taiwan, will not be a 20th century style naval battle. It will be as much fought in the air and in space as under the water and on the surface of the sea. And it will also be a war waged in cyberspace. And I sometimes think that many commentators on these issues underestimate the extent to which the war of the future will be a cyber war. And I worry a little bit that we underestimate our vulnerability in that area. So I think the key point about AUKUS is the range of different things that we're really talking about. It is not just about the subs. And I think it's all about building the kind of technology sharing capability that will improve Australia's as well as the UK's resilience in the event of a new kind of warfare that extends far beyond the familiar conventional domain. You also need to remember, if you read Jim Stavridis's new novel 2034, that a war between the US and China would have the potential to go nuclear. Indeed, in his imaginary conflict set in the 2030s, it does go nuclear. And so we need to be careful here not to assume things about the conflict that lies ahead. There's a nightmare scenario in which we find ourselves unwittingly on the road to World War III. That is something that is not unimaginable if the US and China went to full-scale war over the status of Taiwan. There is also a scenario in which we don't go all the way to war, and we have something more like the Cuban Missile Crisis over Taiwan. But there's a third scenario in which the United States actually folds because it can't, in fact, prevent China from taking control of Taiwan without suffering military defeat at sea. Remember, those aircraft carriers that the US could send in the past to deter China no longer are that effective a deterrent because they can be sunk by China's land-based missiles. There is an arms race going on in the world, which is technological, which you don't capture if you just look at budgets in relation to GDP. The advent of hypersonic missiles changes the nature of warfare too. So I do think it's important to set AUKUS in perspective. We're in the midst of a huge shift in the nature of the geopolitical order. It's becoming clearer and clearer that we are in something like Cold War II, but we're also in a Cold War with different technologies from Cold War One. And these different technologies mean that the next war could be a very different kind of war from the ones that we're accustomed to. And we might look back and say, you know, they made a great fuss about those submarines, but that really wasn't the important part of AUKUS. What was really important related to the cyber domain, to the intelligence cooperation, to technological sharing, which is in fact much broader than simply the sharing of nuclear submarine technology.